Chapter 7. Their eyes followed her admiringly. They had no idea they had been snubbed. It was a disappointment, of course, to find she had forestalled them and that they were not to have the happiness of preparing for her, of watching her face when she arrived and first saw everything, but there was still Mrs. Fisher. They would concentrate on Mrs. Fisher, and would watch her face instead, only, like everybody else, they would have preferred to watch Lady Caroline's. Perhaps, then, as Lady Caroline had talked of breakfast, they had better begin by going and having it, for there was too much to be done that day to spend any more time gazing at the scenery, servants to be interviewed, the house to be gone through and examined, and finally Mrs. Fisher's room to be got ready and adorned. They waved their hands gaily at Lady Caroline, who seemed absorbed in what she saw and took no notice, and turning away found the maidservant of the night before had come up silently behind them in cloth slippers with string soles. She was Francesca, the elderly parlour maid, who had been with the owner, he had said, for years, and whose presence made inventories unnecessary, and after wishing them good morning and hoping they had slept well, she told them breakfast was ready in the dining room on the floor below, and if they would follow her she would lead. They did not understand a single word of the very many in which Francesca succeeded in clothing this simple information, but they followed her, for it at least was clear that they were to follow, and going down the stairs, and along the broad hall like the one above except for glass doors at the end instead of a window opening into the garden, they were shown into the dining room, where, sitting at the head of the table having her breakfast, was Mrs. Fisher. This time they exclaimed. Even Mrs. Arbuthnot exclaimed, though her exclamation was only, "Oh!" Mrs. Wilkins exclaimed at greater length. "Why, but it's like having the bread taken out of one's mouth," exclaimed Mrs. Wilkins. "How do you do?" said Mrs. Fisher. "I can't get up because of my stick." And she stretched out her hand across the table. They advanced and shook it. "We had no idea you were here," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Yes," said Mrs. Fisher, resuming her breakfast. "Yes. I am here." And with composure she removed the top of her egg. "It's a great disappointment," said Mrs. Wilkins. "We had meant to give you such a welcome." This was the one, Mrs. Fisher remembered, briefly glancing at her, who when she came to Prince of Wales Terrace said she had seen Keats. She must be careful with this one, curb her from the beginning. She therefore ignored Mrs. Wilkins and said gravely, with a downward face of impenetrable calm bent on her egg, "Yes. I arrived yesterday with Lady Caroline." "It's really dreadful," said Mrs. Wilkins, exactly as if she had not been ignored. "There's nobody left to get anything ready for now. I feel thwarted. I feel as if the bread had been taken out of my mouth just when I was going to be happy swallowing it." "Where will you sit?" asked Mrs. Fisher of Mrs. Arbuthnot, markedly of Mrs. Arbuthnot. The comparison with the bread seemed to her most unpleasant. "Oh, thank you," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, sitting down rather suddenly next to her. There were only two places she could sit down in, the places laid on either side of Mrs. Fisher. She therefore sat down in one, and Mrs. Wilkins sat down opposite her in the other. Mrs. Fisher was at the head of the table. Round her was grouped the coffee and the tea. Of course they were all sharing San Salvatore equally, but it was she herself and Lottie, Mrs. Arbuthnot mildly reflected, who had found it, who had had the work of getting it, who had chosen to admit Mrs. Fisher into it. Without them, she could not help thinking, Mrs. Fisher would not have been there. Morally Mrs. Fisher was a guest. There was no hostess in this party, but supposing there had been a hostess it would not have been Mrs. Fisher, nor Lady Caroline, it would have been either herself or Lottie. Mrs. Arbuthnot could not help feeling this as she sat down, and Mrs. Fisher, the hand which Ruskin had wrung suspended over the pots before her, inquired, "Tea or coffee?" She could not help feeling it even more definitely when Mrs. Fisher touched a small gong on the table beside her as though she had been used to that gong and that table ever since she was little, and, on Francesca's appearing, bade her in the language of Dante bring more milk. There was a curious air about Mrs. Fisher, thought Mrs. Arbuthnot, of being in possession, and if she herself had not been so happy she would have perhaps minded. Mrs. Wilkins noticed it too, but it only made her discursive brain think of cuckoos. She would no doubt immediately have begun to talk of cuckoos, incoherently, unrestrainably and deplorably, if she had been in the condition of nerves and shyness she was in last time she saw Mrs. Fisher. But happiness had done away with shyness, she was very serene, she could control her conversation, she did not have, horrified, to listen to herself saying things she had no idea of saying when she began, she was quite at her ease, and completely natural. The disappointment of not going to be able to prepare a welcome for Mrs. Fisher had evaporated at once, for it was impossible to go on being disappointed in heaven. Nor did she mind her behaving as hostess. What did it matter? You did not mind things in heaven. She and Mrs. Arbuthnot, therefore, sat down more willingly than they otherwise would have done, one on either side of Mrs. Fisher, and the sun, pouring through the two windows facing east across the bay, flooded the room, and there was an open door leading into the garden, and the garden was full of many lovely things, especially freesias. The delicate and delicious fragrance of the freesias came in through the door and floated round Mrs. Wilkins's enraptured nostrils. Freesias in London were quite beyond her. Occasionally she went into a shop and asked what they cost, so as just to have an excuse for lifting up a bunch and smelling them, well knowing that it was something awful like a shilling for about 3 flowers. Here they were everywhere, bursting out of every corner and carpeting the rose beds. Imagine it, having freesias to pick in armsful if you wanted to, and with glorious sunshine flooding the room, and in your summer frock, and it's being only the 1st of April. I suppose you realize, don't you, that we've got to heaven, she said, beaming at Mrs. Fisher with all the familiarity of a fellow angel. They are considerably younger than I had supposed, thought Mrs. Fisher, and not nearly so plain. And she mused a moment, while she took no notice of Mrs. Wilkins's exuberance, on their instant and agitated refusal that day at Prince of Wales Terrace to have anything to do with the giving or the taking of references. Nothing could affect her, of course, nothing that anybody did. She was far too solidly seated in respectability. At her back stood massively in a tremendous row those 3 great names she had offered, and they were not the only ones she could turn to for support and countenance. Even if these young women, she had no grounds for believing the one out in the garden to be really Lady Caroline Dester, she had merely been told she was, even if these young women should all turn out to be what Browning used to call, how well she remembered his amusing and delightful way of putting things, fly-by-nights, what could it possibly, or in any way matter to her? Let them fly by night if they wished. One was not 65 for nothing. In any case there would only be 4 weeks of it, at the end of which she would see no more of them. And in the meanwhile there were plenty of places where she could sit quietly away from them and remember. Also there was her own sitting room, a charming room, all honey-colored furniture and pictures, with windows to the sea towards Genoa, and a door opening on to the battlements. The house possessed 2 sitting rooms, and she had explained to that pretty creature Lady Caroline, certainly a pretty creature, whatever else she was, Tennyson would have enjoyed taking her for blows on the downs, who had seemed inclined to appropriate the honey-colored one, that she needed some little refuge entirely to herself because of her stick. Nobody wants to see an old woman hobbling about everywhere, she had said. I shall be quite content to spend much of my time by myself in here or sitting out on these convenient battlements. And she had a very nice bedroom, too. It looked 2 ways, across the bay to the morning sun, she liked the morning sun, and onto the garden. There were only 2 of these bedrooms with cross views in the house, she and Lady Caroline had discovered, and they were by far the airiest. They each had 2 beds in them, and she and Lady Caroline had had the extra beds taken out at once and put into 2 of the other rooms. In this way there was much more space and comfort. Lady Caroline, indeed, had turned hers into a bed-sitting room, with the sofa out of the bigger drawing-room and the writing-table and the most comfortable chair, but she herself had not had to do that because she had her own sitting room, equipped with what was necessary. Lady Caroline had thought at first of taking the bigger sitting room entirely for her own, because the dining room on the floor below could quite well be used between meals to sit in by the two others, and was a very pleasant room with nice chairs, but she had not liked the bigger sitting room's shape. It was a round room in the tower, with deep slit windows pierced through the massive walls, and a domed and ribbed ceiling arranged to look like an open umbrella, and it seemed a little dark. Undoubtedly Lady Caroline had cast covetous glances at the honey-colored room, and if she, Mrs. Fisher, had been less firm would have installed herself in it. Which would have been absurd. "I hope," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, smilingly making an attempt to convey to Mrs. Fisher that though she, Mrs. Fisher, might not be exactly a guest, she certainly was not in the very least a hostess, "your room is comfortable." "Quite," said Mrs. Fisher. "Will you have some more coffee?" "No, thank you." "Will you?" "No, thank you." There were 2 beds in my bedroom, filling it up unnecessarily, and I had one taken out. It has made it much more convenient. "Oh, that's why I've got 2 beds in my room," exclaimed Mrs. Wilkins, illuminated. The second bed in her little cell had seemed an unnatural and inappropriate object from the moment she saw it. "I gave no directions," said Mrs. Fisher, addressing Mrs. Arbuthnot. "I merely asked Francesca to remove it." "I have 2 in my room as well," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Your second one must be Lady Caroline's." "She had hers removed too," said Mrs. Fisher. "It seems foolish to have more beds in a room than there are occupiers." "But we haven't got any husbands here either," said Mrs. Wilkins, "and I don't see any use in extra beds in one's room if one hasn't got husbands to put in them." "Can't we have them taken away too?" "Beds," said Mrs. Fisher coldly, "cannot be removed from one room after another. They must remain somewhere." Mrs. Wilkins's remarks seemed to Mrs. Fisher persistently unfortunate. Each time she opened her mouth she said something best left unsaid. Loose talk about husbands had never in Mrs. Fisher's circle been encouraged. In the 80s, when she chiefly flourished, husbands were taken seriously, as the only real obstacles to sin. Beds too, if they had to be mentioned, were approached with caution, and a decent reserve prevented them and husbands ever being spoken of in the same breath. She turned more markedly than ever to Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Do let me give you a little more coffee," she said. "No, thank you." "But won't you have some more?" "No indeed. I never have more than 2 cups at breakfast." "Would you like an orange?" "No, thank you." "Would you?" "No, I don't eat fruit at breakfast. It is an American fashion which I am too old now to adopt." "Have you had all you want?" "Quite." "Have you?" Mrs. Fisher paused before replying. Was this a habit, this trick of answering a simple question with the same question? If so, it must be curbed, for no one could live for 4 weeks in any real comfort with somebody who had a habit. She glanced at Mrs. Arbuthnot, and her parted hair and gentle brow reassured her. No, it was accident, not habit, that had produced those echoes. She could as soon imagine a dove having tiresome habits as Mrs. Arbuthnot. Considering her, she thought what a splendid wife she would have been for poor Carlyle. So much better than that horrid clever Jane. She would have soothed him. "Then shall we go?" she suggested. "Let me help you up," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, all consideration. "Oh, thank you, I can manage perfectly. It's only sometimes that my stick prevents me." Mrs. Fisher got up quite easily. Mrs. Arbuthnot had hovered over her for nothing. "I'm going to have one of these gorgeous oranges," said Mrs. Wilkins, staying where she was and reaching across to a black bowl piled with them. "Rose, how can you resist them? Look, have this one. Do have this beauty," and she held out a big one. "No, I'm going to see to my duties," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, moving towards the door. You'll forgive me for leaving you, won't you?" she added politely to Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher moved towards the door too, quite easily, almost quickly. Her stick did not hinder her at all. She had no intention of being left with Mrs. Wilkins. "What time would you like to have lunch?" Mrs. Arbuthnot asked her, trying to keep her head as at least a non-guest, if not precisely a hostess, above water. "Lunch," said Mrs. Fisher, "is at 12:30. "You shall have it at 12:30 then," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "I'll tell the cook." "It will be a great struggle," she continued, smiling, "but I've brought a little dictionary." "The cook," said Mrs. Fisher, "knows." "Oh," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Lady Caroline has already told her," said Mrs. Fisher. "Oh," said Mrs. Arbuthnot again. "Yes. Lady Caroline speaks the kind of Italian cooks understand. I am prevented going into the kitchen because of my stick. And even if I were able to go, I fear I shouldn't be understood." "But," began Mrs. Arbuthnot. "But it's too wonderful," Mrs. Wilkins finished for her from the table, delighted with these unexpected simplifications in her and Rose's lives. "Why, we've got positively nothing to do here, either of us, except just be happy. You wouldn't believe," she said, turning her head and speaking straight to Mrs. Fisher, portions of orange in either hand, "how terribly good Rose and I have been for years without stopping, and how much now we need a perfect rest." And Mrs. Fisher, going without answering her out of the room, said to herself, she shall be curbed. Chapter 8. Presently, when Mrs. Wilkins and Mrs. Arbuthnot, unhampered by any duties, wandered out and down the worn stone steps and under the pergola into the lower garden, Mrs. Wilkins said to Mrs. Arbuthnot, who seemed pensive, "Don't you see that if somebody else does the ordering it frees us?" Mrs. Arbuthnot said she did see, but nevertheless she thought it rather silly to have everything taken out of their hands. "I love things to be taken out of my hands," said Mrs. Wilkins. "But we found San Salvatore," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, "and it is rather silly that Mrs. Fisher should behave as if it belonged only to her." "What is rather silly," said Mrs. Wilkins with much serenity, "is to mind. I can't see the least point in being in authority at the price of one's liberty." Mrs. Arbuthnot said nothing to that for two reasons: first, because she was struck by the remarkable and growing calm of the hitherto incoherent and excited Lottie, and secondly because what she was looking at was so very beautiful. All down the stone steps on either side were periwinkles in full flower, and she could now see what it was that had caught at her the night before and brushed, wet and scented, across her face. It was wisteria. Wisteria and sunshine, she remembered the advertisement. Here indeed were both in profusion. The wisteria was tumbling over itself in its excess of life, its prodigality of flowering, and where the pergola ended the sun blazed on scarlet geraniums, bushes of them, and nasturtiums in great heaps, and marigolds so brilliant that they seemed to be burning, and red and pink snapdragons, all outdoing each other in bright, fierce color. The ground behind these flaming things dropped away in terraces to the sea, each terrace a little orchard, where among the olives grew vines on trellises, and fig trees, and peach trees, and cherry trees. The cherry trees and peach trees were in blossom, lovely showers of white and deep rose color among the trembling delicacy of the olives. The fig leaves were just big enough to smell of figs, the vine buds were only beginning to show. And beneath these trees were groups of blue and purple irises, and bushes of lavender, and gray, sharp cactuses, and the grass was thick with dandelions and daisies, and right down at the bottom was the sea. Color seemed flung down anyhow, anywhere, every sort of color, piled up in heaps, pouring along in rivers. The periwinkles looked exactly as if they were being poured down each side of the steps, and flowers that grow only in borders in England, proud flowers keeping themselves to themselves over there, such as the great blue irises and the lavender, were being jostled by small, shining common things like dandelions and daisies and the white bells of the wild onion, and only seemed the better. And the more exuberant for it. They stood looking at this crowd of loveliness, this happy jumble, in silence. No, it didn't matter what Mrs. Fisher did, not here, not in such beauty. Mrs. Arbuthnot's discomposure melted out of her. In the warmth and light of what she was looking at, of what to her was a manifestation, an entirely new side of God, how could one be discomposed? If only Frederick were with her, seeing it too, seeing as he would have seen it when first they were lovers, in the days when he saw what she saw and loved what she loved. She sighed. "You mustn't sigh in heaven," said Mrs. Wilkins. "One doesn't." "I was thinking how one longs to share this with those one loves," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "You mustn't long in heaven," said Mrs. Wilkins. "You're supposed to be quite complete there. And it is heaven, isn't it, Rose? See how everything has been let in together, the dandelions and the irises, the vulgar and the superior, me and Mrs. Fisher, all welcome, all mixed up anyhow, and all so visibly happy in enjoying ourselves." "Mrs. Fisher doesn't seem happy, not visibly, anyhow," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, smiling. "She'll begin soon, you'll see." Mrs. Arbuthnot said she didn't believe that after a certain age people began anything. Mrs. Wilkins said she was sure no one, however old and tough, could resist the effects of perfect beauty. Before many days, perhaps only hours, they would see Mrs. Fisher bursting out into every kind of exuberance. "I'm quite sure," said Mrs. Wilkins, "that we've got to heaven, and once Mrs. Fisher realizes that that's where she is, she's bound to be different. You'll see. She'll leave off being ossified, and go all soft and able to stretch, and we shall get quite, why, I shouldn't be surprised if we get quite fond of her." The idea of Mrs. Fisher bursting out into anything, she who seemed so particularly firmly fixed inside her buttons, made Mrs. Arbuthnot laugh. She condoned Lottie's loose way of talking of heaven, because in such a place, on such a morning, condonation was in the very air. Besides, what an excuse there was. And Lady Caroline, sitting where they had left her before breakfast on the wall, peeped over when she heard laughter, and saw them standing on the path below, and thought what a mercy it was they were laughing down there and had not come up and done it round her. She disliked jokes at all times, but in the morning she hated them, especially close up, especially crowding in her ears. She hoped the originals were on their way out for a walk, and not on their way back from one. They were laughing more and more. What could they possibly find to laugh at? She looked down on the tops of their heads with a very serious face, for the thought of spending a month with laughers was a grave one, and they, as though they felt her eyes, turned suddenly and looked up. The dreadful geniality of those women. She shrank away from their smiles and wavings, but she could not shrink out of sight without falling into the lilies. She neither smiled nor waved back, and turning her eyes to the more distant mountains surveyed them carefully till the two, tired of waving, moved away along the path and turned the corner and disappeared. This time they both did notice that they had been met with, at least, unresponsiveness. "If we weren't in heaven," said Mrs. Wilkins serenely, "I should say we had been snubbed, but as nobody snubs anybody there of course we can't have been." "Perhaps she is unhappy," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Whatever it is she'll get over it here," said Mrs. Wilkins with conviction. "We must try and help her," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Oh, but nobody helps anybody in heaven. That's finished with. You don't try to be, or do. You simply are." Well, Mrs. Arbuthnot wouldn't go into that, not here, not today. The vicar, she knew, would have called Lottie's talk levity, if not profanity. How old he seemed from here, an old, old vicar. They left the path, and clambered down the olive terraces, down and down, to where at the bottom the warm, sleepy sea heaved gently among the rocks. There a pine tree grew close to the water, and they sat under it, and a few yards away was a fishing boat lying motionless and green-bellied on the water. The ripples of the sea made little gurgling noises at their feet. They screwed up their eyes to be able to look into the blaze of light beyond the shade of their tree. The hot smell from the pine needles and from the cushions of wild thyme that padded the spaces between the rocks, and sometimes a smell of pure honey from a clump of warm irises up behind them in the sun, puffed across their faces. Very soon Mrs. Wilkins took her shoes and stockings off, and let her feet hang in the water. After watching her a minute Mrs. Arbuthnot did the same. Their happiness was then complete. Their husbands would not have known them. They left off talking. They ceased to mention heaven. They were just cups of acceptance. Meanwhile Lady Caroline, on her wall, was considering her position. The garden on the top of the wall was a delicious garden, but its situation made it insecure and exposed to interruptions. At any moment the others might come and want to use it, because both the hall and the dining room had doors opening straight into it. Perhaps, thought Lady Caroline, she could arrange that it should be solely hers. Mrs. Fisher had the battlements, delightful with flowers, and a watchtower all to herself, besides having snatched the one really nice room in the house. There were plenty of places the originals could go to. She had herself seen at least 2 other little gardens, while the hill the castle stood on was itself a garden, with walks and seats. Why should not this one spot be kept exclusively for her? She liked it best of all. It had the Judas tree and an umbrella pine, it had the freesias and the lilies, it had a tamarisk beginning to flush pink, it had the convenient low wall to sit on, it had from each of its 3 sides the most amazing views, to the east the bay and mountains, to the north the village across the tranquil clear green water of the little harbor and the hills dotted with white houses and orange groves, and to the west was the thin thread of land by which San Salvatore was tied to the mainland, and then the open sea and the coastline beyond Genoa reaching away into the blue dimness of France. Yes, she would say she wanted to have this entirely to herself. How obviously sensible if each of them had their own special place to sit in apart. It was essential to her comfort that she should be able to be apart, left alone, not talked to. The others ought to like it best too. Why heard? One had enough of that in England, with one's relations and friends, oh, the numbers of them, pressing on one continually. Having successfully escaped them for 4 weeks, why continue, and with persons having no earthly claim on one, to herd? She lit a cigarette. She began to feel secure. Those 2 had gone for a walk. There was no sign of Mrs. Fisher. How very pleasant this was. Somebody came out through the glass doors, just as she was drawing a deep breath of security. Surely it couldn't be Mrs. Fisher, wanting to sit with her. Mrs. Fisher had her battlements. She ought to stay on them, having snatched them. It would be too tiresome if she wouldn't, and wanted not only to have them in her sitting room but to establish herself in this garden as well. No, it wasn't Mrs. Fisher, it was the cook. She frowned. Was she going to have to go on ordering the food? Surely one or other of those 2 waving women would do that now. The cook, who had been waiting in increasing agitation in the kitchen, watching the clock getting nearer to lunch-time while she still was without knowledge of what lunch was to consist of, had gone at last to Mrs. Fisher, who had immediately waved her away. She then wandered about the house seeking a mistress, any mistress, who would tell her what to cook, and finding none, and at last, directed by Francesca, who always knew where everybody was, came out to Lady Caroline. Domenico had provided this cook. She was Costanza, the sister of that one of his cousins who kept a restaurant down on the piazza. She helped her brother in his cooking when she had no other job, and knew every sort of fat, mysterious Italian dish such as the workmen of Castagneto, who crowded the restaurant at midday, and the inhabitants of Mezzago when they came over on Sundays, loved to eat. She was a fleshless spinster of 50, grey-haired, nimble, rich of speech, and thought Lady Caroline more beautiful than anyone she had ever seen, and so did Domenico, and so did the boy Giuseppe who helped Domenico and was, besides, his nephew, and so did the girl Angela who helped Francesca and was, besides, Domenico's niece, and so did Francesca herself. Domenico and Francesca, the only two who had seen them, thought the two ladies who arrived last very beautiful, but compared to the fair young lady who arrived first they were as candles to the electric light that had lately been installed, and as the tin tubs in the bedrooms to the wonderful new bathroom their master had arranged on his last visit. Lady Caroline scowled at the cook. The scowl, as usual, was transformed on the way into what appeared to be an intent and beautiful gravity, and Costanza threw up her hands and took the saints aloud to witness that here was the very picture of the Mother of God. Lady Caroline asked her crossly what she wanted, and Costanza's head went on one side with delight at the sheer music of her voice. She said, after waiting a moment in case the music was going to continue, for she didn't wish to miss any of it, that she wanted orders. She had been to the Signorina's mother, but in vain. "She is not my mother," repudiated Lady Caroline angrily, and her anger sounded like the regretful wail of a melodious orphan. Costanza poured forth pity. She too, she explained, had no mother. Lady Caroline interrupted with the curt information that her mother was alive and in London. Costanza praised God and the saints that the young lady did not yet know what it was like to be without a mother. Quickly enough did misfortunes overtake one, no doubt the young lady already had a husband. "No," said Lady Caroline icily. Worse than jokes in the morning did she hate the idea of husbands. And everybody was always trying to press them on her, all her relations, all her friends, all the evening papers. After all, she could only marry one, anyhow, but you would think from the way everybody talked, and especially those persons who wanted to be husbands, that she could marry at least a dozen. Her soft, pathetic no made Costanza, who was standing close to her, well with sympathy. "Poor little one," said Costanza, moved actually to pat her encouragingly on the shoulder, "take hope. There is still time." "For lunch," said Lady Caroline freezingly, marveling as she spoke that she should be patted, she who had taken so much trouble to come to a place, remote and hidden, where she could be sure that among other things of a like oppressive nature pattings also were not. "We will have." Costanza became businesslike. She interrupted with suggestions, and her suggestions were all admirable and all expensive. Lady Caroline did not know they were expensive, and fell in with them at once. They sounded very nice. Every sort of young vegetables and fruits came into them, and much butter and a great deal of cream and incredible numbers of eggs. Costanza said enthusiastically at the end, as a tribute to this acquiescence, that of the many ladies and gentlemen she had worked for on temporary jobs such as this she preferred the English ladies and gentlemen. She more than preferred them, they roused devotion in her. For they knew what to order, they did not skimp, they refrained from grinding down the faces of the poor. From this Lady Caroline concluded that she had been extravagant, and promptly countermanded the cream. Costanza's face fell, for she had a cousin who had a cow, and the cream was to have come from them both. "And perhaps we had better not have chickens," said Lady Caroline. Costanza's face fell more, for her brother at the restaurant kept chickens in his backyard, and many of them were ready for killing. "Also do not order strawberries till I have consulted with the other ladies," said Lady Caroline, remembering that it was only the 1st of April, and that perhaps people who lived in Hampstead might be poor, indeed, must be poor, or why live in Hampstead? "It is not I who am mistress here." "Is it the old one?" asked Costanza, her face very long. "No," said Lady Caroline. "Which of the other two ladies is it?" "Neither," said Lady Caroline. Then Costanza's smiles returned, for the young lady was having fun with her and making jokes. She told her so, in her friendly Italian way, and was genuinely delighted. "I never make jokes," said Lady Caroline briefly. "You had better go, or lunch will certainly not be ready by 12:30. And these curt words came out sounding so sweet that Costanza felt as if kind compliments were being paid her, and forgot her disappointment about the cream and the chickens, and went away all gratitude and smiles. This, thought Lady Caroline, will never do. I haven't come here to housekeep, and I won't. She called Costanza back. Costanza came running. The sound of her name in that voice enchanted her. I have ordered the lunch for today, said Lady Caroline, with the serious angel face that was hers when she was annoyed, and I have also ordered the dinner, but from now on you will go to one of the other ladies for orders. I give no more. The idea that she would go on giving orders was too absurd. She never gave orders at home. Nobody there dreamed of asking her to do anything. That such a very tiresome activity should be thrust upon her here, simply because she happened to be able to talk Italian, was ridiculous. Let the originals give orders if Mrs. Fisher refused to. Mrs. Fisher, of course, was the one nature intended for such a purpose. She had the very air of a competent housekeeper. Her clothes were the clothes of a housekeeper, and so was the way she did her hair. Having delivered herself of her ultimatum with an acerbity that turned sweet on the way, and accompanied it by a peremptory gesture of dismissal that had the grace and loving kindness of a benediction, it was annoying that Costanza should only stand still with her head on one side gazing at her in obvious delight. "Oh, go away," exclaimed Lady Caroline in English, suddenly exasperated. There had been a fly in her bedroom that morning which had stuck just as Costanza was sticking, only one, but it might have been a myriad, it was so tiresome from daylight on. It was determined to settle on her face, and she was determined it should not. Its persistence was uncanny. It woke her, and would not let her go to sleep again. She hit at it, and it eluded her without fuss or effort and with an almost visible blandness, and she had only hit herself. It came back again instantly, and with a loud buzz alighted on her cheek. She hit at it again and hurt herself, while it skimmed gracefully away. She lost her temper, and sat up in bed and waited, watching to hit at it and kill it. She kept on hitting at it at last with fury and with all her strength, as if it were a real enemy deliberately trying to madden her, and it elegantly skimmed in and out of her blows, not even angry, to be back again the next instant. It succeeded every time in getting on to her face, and was quite indifferent how often it was driven away. That was why she had dressed and come out so early. Francesca had already been told to put a net over her bed, for she was not going to allow herself to be annoyed twice like that. People were exactly like flies. She wished there were nets for keeping them off too. She hit at them with words and frowns, and like the fly they slipped between her blows and were untouched. Worse than the fly, they seemed unaware that she had even tried to hit them. The fly at least did for a moment go away. With human beings the only way to get rid of them was to go away herself. That was what, so tired, she had done this April, and having got here, having got close up to the details of life at San Salvatore, it appeared that here, too, she was not to be let alone. Viewed from London there had seemed to be no details. San Salvatore from there seemed to be an empty, a delicious blank. Yet, after only 24 hours of it, she was discovering that it was not a blank at all, and that she was having to ward off as actively as ever. Already she had been much stuck to. Mrs. Fisher had stuck nearly the whole of the day before, and this morning there had been no peace, not 10 minutes uninterruptedly alone. Costanza of course had finally to go because she had to cook, but hardly had she gone before Domenico came. He came to water and tie up. That was natural, since he was the gardener, but he watered and tied up all the things that were nearest to her. He hovered closer and closer, he watered to excess, he tied plants that were as straight and steady as arrows. Well, at least he was a man, and therefore not quite so annoying, and his smiling good morning was received with an answering smile, upon which Domenico forgot his family, his wife, his mother, his grown-up children and all his duties, and only wanted to kiss the young lady's feet. He could not do that, unfortunately, but he could talk while he worked, and talk he did, voluminously, pouring out every kind of information, illustrating what he said with gestures so lively that he had to put down the watering pot and thus delay the end of the watering. Lady Caroline bore it for a time but presently was unable to bear it, and as he would not go, and she could not tell him to, seeing that he was engaged in his proper work, once again it was she who had to. She got off the wall and moved to the other side of the garden, where in a wooden shed were some comfortable low cane chairs. All she wanted was to turn one of these round with its back to Domenico and its front to the sea towards Genoa. Such a little thing to want. One would have thought she might have been allowed to do that unmolested. But he, who watched her every movement, when he saw her approaching the chairs darted after her and seized one and asked to be told where to put it. Would she never get away from being waited on, being made comfortable, being asked where she wanted things put, having to say thank you? She was short with Domenico, who instantly concluded the sun had given her a headache, and ran in and fetched her a sunshade and a cushion and a footstool, and was skilful, and was wonderful, and was one of nature's gentlemen. She shut her eyes in a heavy resignation. She could not be unkind to Domenico. She could not get up and walk indoors as she would have done if it had been one of the others. Domenico was intelligent and very competent. She had at once discovered that it was he who really ran the house, who really did everything. And his manners were definitely delightful, and he undoubtedly was a charming person. It was only that she did so much long to be let alone. If only she could be left quite quiet for this 1 month, she felt that she might perhaps make something of herself after all. She kept her eyes shut, because then he would think she wanted to sleep and would go away. Domenico's romantic Italian soul melted within him at the sight, for having her eyes shut was extraordinarily becoming to her. He stood entranced, quite still, and she thought he had stolen away, so she opened them again. No, there he was, staring at her. Even he. There was no getting away from being stared at. "I have a headache," she said, shutting them again. "It is the sun," said Domenico, and sitting on the wall without a hat. "I wish to sleep." "Si, signorina," he said sympathetically, and went softly away. She opened her eyes with a sigh of relief. The gentle closing of the glass doors showed her that he had not only gone quite away but had shut her out in the garden so that she should be undisturbed. Now perhaps she would be alone till lunch-time. It was very curious, and no one in the world could have been more surprised than she herself, but she wanted to think. She had never wanted to do that before. Everything else that it is possible to do without too much inconvenience she had either wanted to do or had done at one period or another of her life, but not before had she wanted to think. She had come to San Salvatore with the single intention of lying comatose for 4 weeks in the sun, somewhere where her parents and friends were not, lapped in forgetfulness, stirring herself only to be fed, and she had not been there more than a few hours when this strange new desire took hold of her. There had been wonderful stars the evening before, and she had gone out into the top garden after dinner, leaving Mrs. Fisher alone over her nuts and wine, and, sitting on the wall at the place where the lilies crowded their ghost heads, she had looked out into the gulf of the night, and it had suddenly seemed as if her life had been a noise all about nothing. She had been intensely surprised. She knew stars and darkness did produce unusual emotions because, in others, she had seen them being produced, but they had not before done it in herself. A noise all about nothing. Could she be quite well? She had wondered. For a long while past she had been aware that her life was a noise, but it had seemed to be very much about something, a noise, indeed, about so much that she felt she must get out of earshot for a little or she would be completely, and perhaps permanently, deafened. But suppose it was only a noise about nothing? She had not had a question like that in her mind before. It had made her feel lonely. She wanted to be alone, but not lonely. That was very different, that was something that ached and hurt dreadfully right inside one. It was what one dreaded most. It was what made one go to so many parties, and lately even the parties had seemed once or twice not to be a perfectly certain protection. Was it possible that loneliness had nothing to do with circumstances, but only with the way one met them? Perhaps, she had thought, she had better go to bed. She couldn't be very well. She went to bed, and in the morning, after she had escaped the fly and had her breakfast and got out again into the garden, there was this same feeling again, and in broad daylight. Once more she had that really rather disgusting suspicion that her life till now had not only been loud but empty. Well, if that were so, and if her first 28 years, the best ones, had gone just in meaningless noise, she had better stop a moment and look round her, pause, as they said in tiresome novels, and consider. She hadn't got many sets of 28 years. One more would see her growing very like Mrs. Fisher. Two more, she averted her eyes. Her mother would have been concerned if she had known. Her mother doted. Her father would have been concerned too, for he also doted. Everybody doted. And when, melodiously obstinate, she had insisted on going off to entomb herself in Italy for a whole month with queer people she had got out of an advertisement, refusing even to take her maid, the only explanation her friends could imagine was that poor Scrap, such was her name among them, had overdone it and was feeling a little nervy. Her mother had been distressed at her departure. It was such an odd thing to do, such a sign of disappointment. She encouraged the general idea of the verge of a nervous breakdown. If she could have seen her adored Scrap, more delightful to look upon than any other mother's daughter had ever yet been, the object of her utmost pride, the source of all her fondest hopes, sitting staring at the empty noonday Mediterranean considering her 3 possible sets of 28 years, she would have been miserable. To go away alone was bad, to think was worse. No good could come out of the thinking of a beautiful young woman. Complications could come out of it in profusion, but no good. The thinking of the beautiful was bound to result in hesitations, in reluctances, in unhappiness all round. And here, if she could have seen her, sat her Scrap thinking quite hard. And such things. Such old things. Things nobody ever began to think till they were at least 40. Chapter 9. That one of the 2 sitting rooms which Mrs. Fisher had taken for her own was a room of charm and character. She surveyed it with satisfaction on going into it after breakfast, and was glad it was hers. It had a tiled floor, and walls the color of pale honey, and inlaid furniture the color of amber, and mellow books, many in ivory or lemon-colored covers. There was a big window overlooking the sea towards Genoa, and a glass door through which she could proceed out onto the battlements and walk along past the quaint and attractive watch-tower, in itself a room with chairs and a writing table, to where on the other side of the tower the battlements ended in a marble seat, and one could see the western bay and the point round which began the Gulf of Spezia. Her south view, between these 2 stretches of sea, was another hill, higher than San Salvatore, the last of the little peninsula, with the bland turrets of a smaller and uninhabited castle on the top, on which the setting sun still shone when everything else was sunk in shadow. Yes, she was very comfortably established here, and receptacles, Mrs. Fisher did not examine their nature closely, but they seemed to be small stone troughs, or perhaps little sarcophagi, ringed round the battlements with flowers. These battlements, she thought, considering them, would have been a perfect place for her to pace up and down gently in moments when she least felt the need of her stick, or to sit in on the marble seat, having first put a cushion on it, if there had not unfortunately been a second glass door opening onto them, destroying their complete privacy, spoiling her feeling that the place was only for her. The second door belonged to the round drawing-room, which both she and Lady Caroline had rejected as too dark. That room would probably be sat in by the women from Hampstead, and she was afraid they would not confine themselves to sitting in it, but would come out through the glass door and invade her battlements. This would ruin the battlements. It would ruin them as far as she was concerned if they were to be overrun, or even if, not actually overrun, they were liable to be raked by the eyes of persons inside the room. No one could be perfectly at ease if they were being watched and knew it. What she wanted, what she surely had a right to, was privacy. She had no wish to intrude on the others, why then should they intrude on her? And she could always relax her privacy if, when she became better acquainted with her companions, she should think it worthwhile, but she doubted whether any of the three would so develop as to make her think it worthwhile. Hardly anything was really worthwhile, reflected Mrs. Fisher, except the past. It was astonishing, it was simply amazing, the superiority of the past to the present. Those friends of hers in London, solid persons of her own age, knew the same past that she knew, could talk about it with her, could compare it as she did with the tinkling present, and in remembering great men forget for a moment the trivial and barren young people who still, in spite of the war, seemed to litter the world in such numbers. She had not come away from these friends, these conversable ripe friends, in order to spend her time in Italy chatting with three persons of another generation and defective experience, she had come away merely to avoid the treacheries of a London April. It was true what she had told the two who came to Prince of Wales Terrace, that all she wished to do at San Salvatore was to sit by herself in the sun and remember. They knew this, for she had told them. It had been plainly expressed and clearly understood. Therefore she had a right to expect them to stay inside the round drawing-room and not to emerge interruptingly on to her battlements. But would they? The doubt spoilt her morning. It was only towards lunch-time that she saw a way to be quite safe, and ringing for Francesca, bade her, in slow and majestic Italian, shut the shutters of the glass door of the round drawing-room, and then, going with her into the room, which had become darker than ever in consequence, but also, Mrs. Fisher observed to Francesca, who was being voluble, would because of this very darkness remain agreeably cool, and after all there were the numerous slit windows in the walls to let in light and it was nothing to do with her if they did not let it in, she directed the placing of a cabinet of curios across the door on its inside. This would discourage egress. Then she rang for Domenico, and caused him to move one of the flower-filled sarcophagi across the door on its outside. This would discourage ingress. No one, said Domenico, hesitating, will be able to use the door. No one, said Mrs. Fisher firmly, will wish to. She then retired to her sitting-room, and from a chair placed where she could look straight on to them, gazed at her battlements, secured to her now completely, with calm pleasure. Being here, she reflected placidly, was much cheaper than being in an hotel and, if she could keep off the others, immeasurably more agreeable. She was paying for her rooms, extremely pleasant rooms, now that she was arranged in them, £3 a week, which came to about 8 shillings a day, battlements, watch-tower and all. Where else abroad could she live as well for so little, and have as many baths as she liked, for 8 shillings a day? Of course she did not yet know what her food would cost, but she would insist on carefulness over that, though she would also insist on its being carefulness combined with excellence. The two were perfectly compatible if the caterer took pains. The servants' wages, she had ascertained, were negligible, owing to the advantageous exchange, so that there was only the food to cause her anxiety. If she saw signs of extravagance she would propose that they each hand over a reasonable sum every week to Lady Caroline which should cover the bills, any of it that was not used to be returned, and if it were exceeded the loss to be borne by the caterer. Mrs. Fisher was well off and had the desire for comforts proper to her age, but she disliked expenses. So well off was she that, had she so chosen, she could have lived in an opulent part of London and driven from it and to it in a Rolls-Royce. She had no such wish. It needed more vitality than went with true comfort to deal with a house in an opulent spot and a Rolls-Royce. Worries attended such possessions, worries of every kind, crowned by bills. In the sober gloom of Prince of Wales Terrace she could obscurely enjoy inexpensive yet real comfort, without being snatched at by predatory men-servants or collectors for charities, and a taxi-stand was at the end of the road. Her annual outlay was small. The house was inherited. Death had furnished it for her. She trod in the dining room on the Turkey carpet of her father's, she regulated her day by the excellent black marble clock on the mantelpiece which she remembered from childhood. Her walls were entirely covered by the photographs her illustrious deceased friends had given either herself or her father, with their own handwriting across the lower parts of their bodies, and the windows, shrouded by the maroon curtains of all her life, were decorated besides with the selfsame aquariums to which she owed her first lessons in sea lore, and in which still swam slowly the goldfishes of her youth. Were they the same goldfish? She did not know. Perhaps, like carp, they outlived everybody. Perhaps, on the other hand, behind the deep-sea vegetation provided for them at the bottom, they had from time to time as the years went by withdrawn and replaced themselves. Were they or were they not, she sometimes wondered, contemplating them between the courses of her solitary meals, the same goldfish that had that day been there when Carlyle, how well she remembered it, angrily strode up to them in the middle of some argument with her father that had grown heated, and striking the glass smartly with his fist had put them to flight, shouting as they fled, "Och, ye deaf devils! Och, ye lucky deaf devils! Ye can't hear anything of the blasted, blethering, doddering, glaikit fool stuff your maester talks, can ye?" Or words to that effect. Dear, great-souled Carlyle! Such natural gushings forth, such true freshness, such real grandeur. Rugged, if you will, yes, undoubtedly sometimes rugged, and startling in a drawing-room, but magnificent. Who was there now to put beside him? Who was there to mention in the same breath? Her father, than whom no one had had more flair, said, "Thomas is immortal." And here was this generation of puniness, raising its little voice in doubts, or, still worse, not giving itself the trouble to raise it at all, not, it was incredible, but it had been thus reported to her, even reading him. Mrs. Fisher did not read him either, but that was different. She had read him, she had certainly read him. Of course she had read him. There was Teufelsdrock, she quite well remembered a tailor called Teufelsdrock. So like Carlyle to call him that. Yes, she must have read him, though naturally details escaped her. The gong sounded. Lost in reminiscence, Mrs. Fisher had forgotten time, and hastened to her bedroom to wash her hands and smooth her hair. She did not wish to be late and set a bad example, and perhaps find her seat at the head of the table taken. One could put no trust in the manners of the younger generation, especially not in those of that Mrs. Wilkins. She was, however, the first to arrive in the dining room. Francesca in a white apron stood ready with an enormous dish of smoking hot, glistening macaroni, but nobody was there to eat it. Mrs. Fisher sat down, looking stern. "Lax, lax. Serve me," she said to Francesca, who showed a disposition to wait for the others. Francesca served her. Of the party she liked Mrs. Fisher least, in fact she did not like her at all. She was the only one of the four ladies who had not yet smiled. True she was old, true she was unbeautiful, true she therefore had no reason to smile, but kind ladies smiled, reason or no. They smiled, not because they were happy but because they wished to make happy. This one of the four ladies could not then, Francesca decided, be kind, so she handed her the macaroni, being unable to hide any of her feelings, morosely. It was very well cooked, but Mrs. Fisher had never cared for macaroni, especially not this long, worm-shaped variety. She found it difficult to eat, slippery, wriggling off her fork, making her look, she felt, undignified when, having got it as she supposed into her mouth, ends of it yet hung out. Always, too, when she ate it she was reminded of Mr. Fisher. He had during their married life behaved very much like macaroni. He had slipped, he had wriggled, he had made her feel undignified, and when at last she had got him safe, as she thought, there had invariably been little bits of him that still, as it were, hung out. Francesca from the sideboard watched Mrs. Fisher's way with macaroni gloomily, and her gloom deepened when she saw her at last take her knife to it and chop it small. Mrs. Fisher really did not know how else to get hold of the stuff. She was aware that knives in this connection were improper, but one did finally lose patience. Macaroni was never allowed to appear on her table in London. Apart from its tiresomeness, she did not even like it, and she would tell Lady Caroline not to order it again. Years of practice, reflected Mrs. Fisher, chopping it up, years of actual living in Italy, would be necessary to learn the exact trick. Browning managed macaroni wonderfully. She remembered watching him one day when he came to lunch with her father, and a dish of it had been ordered as a compliment to his connection with Italy. Fascinating, the way it went in. No chasing round the plate, no slidings off the fork, no subsequent protrusions of loose ends, just one dig, one whisk, one thrust, one gulp, and lo, yet another poet had been nourished. "Shall I go and seek the young lady?" asked Francesca, unable any longer to look on a good macaroni being cut with a knife. Mrs. Fisher came out of her reminiscent reflections with difficulty. "She knows lunch is at 12:30, she said. "They all know." "She may be asleep," said Francesca. "The other ladies are further away, but this one is not far away." "Beat the gong again then," said Mrs. Fisher. What manners, she thought, what manners. It was not an hotel, and considerations were due. She must say she was surprised at Mrs. Arbuthnot, who had not looked like somebody unpunctual. Lady Caroline, too, she had seemed amiable and courteous, whatever else she might be. From the other one, of course, she expected nothing. Francesca fetched the gong, and took it out into the garden and advanced, beating it as she advanced, close up to Lady Caroline, who, still stretched in her low chair, waited till she had done, and then turned her head and in the sweetest tones poured forth what appeared to be music but was really invective. Francesca did not recognize the liquid flow as invective. How was she to, when it came out sounding like that? And with her face all smiles, for she could not but smile when she looked at this young lady, she told her the macaroni was getting cold. "When I do not come to meals it is because I do not wish to come to meals," said the irritated Scrap, "and you will not in future disturb me." "Is she ill?" asked Francesca, sympathetic but unable to stop smiling. Never had she seen hair so beautiful. Like pure flax, like the hair of northern babes. On such a little head only blessing could rest, on such a little head the nimbus of the holiest saints could fitly be placed. Scrap shut her eyes and refused to answer. In this she was injudicious, for its effect was to convince Francesca, who hurried away full of concern to tell Mrs. Fisher, that she was indisposed. And Mrs. Fisher, being prevented, she explained, from going out to Lady Caroline herself because of her stick, sent the two others instead, who had come in at that moment heated and breathless and full of excuses, while she herself proceeded to the next course, which was a very well-made omelette, bursting most agreeably at both its ends with young green peas. "Serve me," she directed Francesca, who again showed a disposition to wait for the others. "Oh, why won't they leave me alone, oh, why won't they leave me alone?" Scrap asked herself when she heard more scrunchings on the little pebbles which took the place of grass, and therefore knew some one else was approaching. She kept her eyes tight shut this time. Why should she go into lunch if she didn't want to? This wasn't a private house, she was in no way tangled up in duties towards a tiresome hostess. For all practical purposes San Salvatore was an hotel, and she ought to be let alone to eat or not to eat exactly as if she really had been in an hotel. But the unfortunate Scrap could not just sit still and close her eyes without rousing that desire to stroke and pet in her beholders with which she was only too familiar. Even the cook had patted her. And now a gentle hand, how well she knew and how much she dreaded gentle hands, was placed on her forehead. "I'm afraid you're not well," said a voice that was not Mrs. Fisher's, and therefore must belong to one of the originals. "I have a headache," murmured Scrap. Perhaps it was best to say that, perhaps it was the shortest cut to peace. "I'm so sorry," said Mrs. Arbuthnot softly, for it was her hand being gentle. "And I," said Scrap to herself, "who thought if I came here I would escape mothers." "Don't you think some tea would do you good?" asked Mrs. Arbuthnot tenderly. Tea. The idea was abhorrent to Scrap. In this heat to be drinking tea in the middle of the day. "No," she murmured. "I expect what would really be best for her," said another voice, "is to be left quiet." How sensible, thought Scrap, and raised the eyelashes of one eye just enough to peep through and see who was speaking. It was the freckled original. The dark one, then, was the one with the hand. The freckled one rose in her esteem. "But I can't bear to think of you with a headache and nothing being done for it," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Would a cup of strong black coffee?" Scrap said no more. She waited, motionless and dumb, till Mrs. Arbuthnot should remove her hand. After all, she couldn't stand there all day, and when she went away she would have to take her hand with her. "I do think," said the freckled one, "that she wants nothing except quiet." And perhaps the freckled one pulled the one with the hand by the sleeve, for the hold on Scrap's forehead relaxed, and after a minute's silence, during which no doubt she was being contemplated, she was always being contemplated, the footsteps began to scrunch the pebbles again, and grew fainter, and were gone. "Lady Caroline has a headache," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, re-entering the dining room and sitting down in her place next to Mrs. Fisher. "I can't persuade her to have even a little tea or some black coffee. Do you know what aspirin is in Italian?" "The proper remedy for headaches," said Mrs. Fisher firmly, "is castor oil." "But she hasn't got a headache," said Mrs. Wilkins. "Carlyle," said Mrs. Fisher, who had finished her omelette and had leisure, while she waited for the next course, to talk, suffered at one period terribly from headaches, and he constantly took castor oil as a remedy. He took it, I should say, almost to excess, and called it, I remember, in his interesting way the oil of sorrow. My father said it colored for a time his whole attitude to life, his whole philosophy. But that was because he took too much. What Lady Caroline wants is one dose, and one only. It is a mistake to keep on taking castor oil. "Do you know the Italian for it?" asked Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Ah, that I'm afraid I don't. However, she would know. You can ask her." "But she hasn't got a headache," repeated Mrs. Wilkins, who was struggling with the macaroni. "She only wants to be let alone." They both looked at her. The word shovel crossed Mrs. Fisher's mind in connection with Mrs. Wilkins's actions at that moment. "Then why should she say she has?" asked Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Because she is still trying to be polite. Soon she won't try, when the place has got more into her, she'll really be it. Without trying. Naturally. Lottie, you see," explained Mrs. Arbuthnot, smiling to Mrs. Fisher, who sat waiting with a stony patience for her next course, delayed because Mrs. Wilkins would go on trying to eat the macaroni, which must be less worth eating than ever now that it was cold. "Lottie, you see, has a theory about this place." But Mrs. Fisher had no wish to hear any theory of Mrs. Wilkins's. "I am sure I don't know," she interrupted, looking severely at Mrs. Wilkins, "why you should assume Lady Caroline is not telling the truth." "I don't assume, I know," said Mrs. Wilkins. "And pray how do you know?" asked Mrs. Fisher icily, for Mrs. Wilkins was actually helping herself to more macaroni, offered her officiously and unnecessarily a second time by Francesca. "When I was out there just now I saw inside her." Well, Mrs. Fisher wasn't going to say anything to that, she wasn't going to trouble to reply to downright idiocy. Instead she sharply rapped the little table gong by her side, though there was Francesca standing at the sideboard, and said, for she would wait no longer for her next course, "Serve me." And Francesca, it must have been wilful, offered her the macaroni again.